I'm going to do my own intro, is what I was told. So if you're at EmberCamp and you're looking forward to fast feedback, forward progress, you're in the right talk. I'm Toran Billups. I've been writing Ember since 2012. I have a few add-ons I hack on, and I'm a front-end engineer full-time, so I write Ember for my day job. Fun fact about this photo, my wife's not a huge fan. Says that I haven't aged, or I don't look exactly like this photo anymore. So I came up with a few candidates to replace this, but it turns out I'm most photogenic during a fishing trip. So I'm going to come up with something new, get her approval on it this time. I might look like this on the internet very, very soon. So my one shameless plug, I started a podcast earlier this year called Developing Fatigue with a few friends of mine. And we just wrapped up the first season, actually. And the thing I would miss most about not doing this podcast every week, aside from my friends, is the segment we call Big Wins. And this was kind of a fun segment where we got really positive about something that happened in our week. And as a side effect, something really cool happened. Because not every week was great, right? We've all had those programming weeks where there's absolutely nothing, or it appears there's nothing positive. But we had to be intentional and look for good things, even if the whole situation was bad. And the more I did this throughout that show, especially this summer, the more I wanted this positivity to spil out into other things, other parts of my life. And so I started writing this talk with this in mind. And of course, I want to share something practical, some tips. We're at a software conference after all. Take something away from this you can use. But more importantly, I wanted to lift everybody up. And so I decided to come up with an ambitious goal for this talk. I wanted everyone to feel, leaving here today, that they could find within them or discover within them this 10x engineer and unleash it. And I think in tech especially, it's so important to share some kind of uplifting message at this conference because we get in our own heads all too often. And we begin to believe this story that there's actually only a select few who have what it takes to be the very best designers and developers. And I know this from personal experience. Those closest to me know I'm kind of a perfectionist, so this kind of builds, I'm often overthinking what I'm going to say, what I'm going to do. As a result, what I'll be or what I won't be. And you do this long enough, you start to think you're the only one doubting. Recently, though, this hit home. I had a coworker actually tell me these words, said, "I could never be like you." I thought that was odd until I inspected a little deeper and realized I put programmers on a pedestal all the time. This is actually pretty normal, unfortunately. But it was in this moment that I realized I hadn't actually done anything to dispel the myth. You see, he was speaking in particular about my productivity, but I would probably classify it as perceived productivity. And it was in this moment that I wanted to improve this and truly dispel this myth. You see, the truth is I'm not an exceptional programmer myself. I'm competent, sure, I get the job done, but I've got some exceptional habits. That much for sure. So I want to share one of those habits today with everybody, hoping they can use this habit, which is pretty accessible to everybody, to lift themselves up and be a 10x engineer. And that habit is simply working smarter. I don't know who to attribute this quote to. It's all over the internet, but I find just being most efficient with our time is a really valuable habit. And we're going to talk about this in particular, being a little less fuzzy than just work smarter. For today, we're going to talk about how I do that in one particular case, which is getting fast feedback in everything that I do. And we're going to break this down contextually in 3 different use cases, just to give you a sense of what fast feedback looks like, how to get it, why it's valuable. So this first story is on test-driven development. And if you're familiar with this idea, this isn't new. Don't worry, I promise to tell a story that you don't already know. And on the other end of the spectrum, if this is the first time you're hearing about test-driven development, that's OK. We're going to level set real quick, and we'll just kind of talk about the mechanics briefly. There are 3 steps in test-driven development. We write a test. We want to encode some verification of a behavior, some feature or some bug. The reason this circle is red is originally, if you run this verification step, of course, it's going to tell you, hey, that thing doesn't yet exist. So our second step is to write the code to make this feature work. And the reason that circle is green, of course, we run that verification. It should say thumbs up, everything's good. Lastly, you get a chance to refactor, improve, refine that because you have a tight feedback loop now with our automation in this verification step. Of course, it wouldn't be EmberCamp if I didn't give Melanie and everybody a plug. This is, of course, easy in Ember. Testing was, I think Sam or somebody already called this out earlier. And I think it's actually easy in Ember for two different reasons. The first is, of course, Ember CLI, a lot of the conventions, the work that's come out of the early Ember app kit from years ago. We get a test runner, assertion library. If you don't like some of the stuff that ships out of the box, you can Ember install. And those are great, actually. I want to thank especially Steph Penner, who in the early days for me did a bunch of heavy lifting on his own to raise all boats. And that's been huge. But almost more important than the tooling, the tech, which is all good stuff, I think our community, the shared values around testing and quality, test-driven development. I don't think I've ever joined a team and had to go to bat or argue with someone about writing tests. It was implied. It's in the fabric of that team's DNA. So that's what I think makes writing tests easy in Ember. Now today I promise not to tell you a story that you already know. And there are good things about test-driven development. Things like regression testing, executable documentation, design feedback. Those are all fine. They stand on their own. We're not going to talk about those today. Instead, we're just going to look at test-driven development from the angle of the feedback loop verifying the work that we do. So we're going to do that by looking at a really simple feature. I tried to boil this down as small as I could. We're going to be, in particular, looking at this preferences panel where you can change the theme of the application from light to dark. And don't ask why the panel is still dark. That's a whole other can of worms. There's probably something on the product roadmap. Who knows? I'm going to show as big as I can the text here of the HTML. It's super, super basic. We're going to add an on-click to our radio button. So here's the radio button. And then afterwards, we're just going to do an update to add on-click action, update theme. I'm showing this as big as I can because the demos we're going to do, there's going to be kind of a split between the browser and the editor. Might not be as easy to read this. The second part of this feature is that we want to denote in CSS visually some kind of check to see, hey, which theme is applied, although it should be pretty obvious, dark or light. And we're going to do that from label by just adding a conditional that says, hey, if theme is light, dark, add checked, or don't add checked. And we're going to look at this in two different live coding demos. The first is going to be, let's just hack around in the browser. And so we're going to start by verifying the behavior does not work. And we're just going to click that light button in the far corner. It doesn't work. So we'll go back to the code here and add our on-clicks that we just looked at, which is really simple. Fires an action in our component and just gives it light or dark as a string. That ultimately should flip the CSS class. So now when we come back in, click the panel, click our light radio button here, and ta-da, it works. Second feature, of course, you can see there's not really a circle in those radio buttons. So we're going to go back to the code itself and add a conditional to the class, just like you saw in HTML. It just basically says if the theme is light, add checked. And now when we reload this, come out, you can see the dark theme is checked to start because we have the dark theme applied. And as we click the light theme, that is applied. Pretty basic stuff. Let's take a look at it in the test-driven feedback loop. So we start right away by writing a test. The first step in that mechanic is to say, hey, if we click the radio button, the theme has changed from dark to light. That's really all we're doing in this simple QUnit test here. We save that. And of course, the first step, we want actually a failing test. Otherwise, we don't need to write any code. So this just verifies that we do need to write some code. The exact same on-click that you just saw a minute ago, we'll add that. And of course, the test passes. The second assertions we're going to do are just to verify that we actually have that checked class applied correctly, so the conditional is working for both light and dark. And of course, we get our expected failure. We just don't have a conditional for that right now. Make that quick change, save it. And of course, we're good. I have to call out, I get a lot of trouble for my demos, apparently. Everybody thinks like I am perfect, and these are, of course, recorded. But my demos are so far from perfect. I think my favorite joke is if you came to talk to me in the middle of any feature I was working on, there's probably a 90% chance that if you said, hey, what are you doing? Like, I don't even know, nothing works anymore. That's like traditionally where I'm at. I only do those demos this way, of course, to save time. We only have 30 minutes. But I want to be real and present kind of the true story behind programming, at least my programming life day to day. It's that programming is messy. So let's take a look at this same example in kind of like my first pass on it. And this is an honest first pass, which is kind of the saddest part. So I'm going to add an onClick, which was update theme. And I don't know about you guys, but I seem to constantly struggle with like, do I quote this action? Do I not quote this action? So that's what's happening here in the first run is I actually completely messed this up. And now my app is like broken. It doesn't even render right. So I right-click this and go to the console. I'm like, oh, there's an Ember error. What's up with this? It's like, oh, this action is not defined. Oh, OK. Coin flip. I got it wrong this time. We'll go add the string. And we do that. Cool. I know it's a radio button, and it has a value of light or dark. So when I bubble this action through, should just bubble that event through, probably gets destructured, everything's fine. Turns out not. So in our second attempt here, we'll go out, click our panel, click light, nothing happens. We don't actually destructure the event we expected, of course, that primitive string value of light or dark. We go, we go back, we add light, dark to the right onClick here. Finally reload this here. Finally, it works. Now there's a whole other like 3 minutes of shame. We just do not have time for that. Me struggling to get that conditional, which is embarrassing. So assuming I'm employable after this, being real with you guys, the whole point of that is, this can't just be me. Especially, this has been happening my whole career. I feel like software is truly just full of experimentation, failure, and more than just finding one solution, which is usually our task, right? We're finding many ways that things don't work. So if we believe this idea that software is more about experimentation and failing, we want a feedback loop that lets us experiment and learn rapidly. So what might be slowing us down in that first example? So every time I make an experiment or come up with some solution I think is going to work this time, I start running a set of manual testing scripts in my head. Starts by clicking this little admin button, which slides out the panel. And then I would click the light radio button itself just to verify everything visually. And not all that long ago, big software companies put whole teams of people in rooms, and they would execute manual scripts written on paper. I kid you not. Sometimes they still do. I won't tell you if we do that or not. I think we're not doing that. Anyway, leadership at these companies on the quality side in particular have changed their views on this in recent years. In fact, they're investing more in automation. They want to get more done with less. So it makes sense to me that if the leaders and the developers and the quality engineers all believe in automation, we also believe testing is messy, it's full of experimentation and failure. Why do we have such a hard time answering this question? So let's get some perspective here. Real talk. Doing the test-driven example, the one we started out with where we actually wrote a test first, there is no denying that we are actually spending more time up front, especially compared to the other example. We just flat out don't write any code. But again, programming, we rarely get this right the first time. Some point along the way, we hit this inflection where we start to look at that test a little differently now. It's more of an investment. And the investment, especially as your software grows in size, your feature grows in complexity, the more experiments you run, the more value you get back. So the choice is yours, but I choose a feedback loop designed with experimentation and learning in mind, so I choose productivity. All right, let's take a look at our second example, hot reloading. So if anybody has not yet seen this, we're going to do a really basic demo just to get you familiar with the idea. We're going to use the to-do MVC example, hoping, raise your hand if you've kind of seen, know this demo. OK. Small hands. I know I'm pitting out too. I don't want to get too crazy with it. We're We're just going to show really simple at the bottom of this footer component, we're going to be adding a couple other HTML components. One that has the count on the far left and one that has the unordered list for filtering in the middle. So our first little demo here, you can see to-do. And we start out by saving this to-dos count that we put in, and it pops in that corner there as one item left. Pretty basic stuff here. Next, we're going to add the unordered list. And this is where it's important to note that the browser basically does a full page reload. That's this idea of live reload. We just reload the entire page when we add HTML. We'll take a look at, by contrast, the hot reload example. Doing the exact same thing. We start by adding our count. Of course, it shows up in the corner, just as you'd expect. We add a couple things to our to-do list. We add our unordered list. Now, this is where you should note, instantly it just pops in at the bottom of that footer. We don't reload the page. Hot reloading. Cool. Now, the first time I saw this, I was actually not cool. I remember thinking that. Dan Abramoff showed this at some Europe conference. And I thought, I already do test-driven development. I don't need this. The truth is, this is a very different style of verification for me. It's not so much the behavior of the system, the JavaScript. It's how things look, the padding, the margin, how it's laid out, how components compose and look together. Very different visual. Unfortunately, this is not quite yet easy in Ember. So I had to bend the rules. Hopefully, Melanie's OK with that. Easy-ish is what I said. And that's because I put an add-on together a while back that allows you to accomplish what you just saw. It works with Ember 3.4. And this is how it works, very simply. We basically wrap your component. In this case, it was a footer. We allow Ember CLI to do all the heavy lifting on change detection. We simply omit reloading the page and recreating the Ember app. Instead, we alert the browser of this change and say, hey, pull in that new component. So we append the script tag. And finally, in line, without reloading the entire page, we just say, hey, component, re-render. Now, this is the first time you've seen or heard about hot reloading. It's probably because there was a time I was actually pretty discouraged. I wrote this add-on. I was pretty jazzed. Not going to lie. And I showed it off to a few people, and they were like, Toran, that's just a gimmick. I'm not going to use that. And I thought, oh, OK, cool. It's cool. Step away. And unfortunately, in my career at that time, I was actually doing a lot more JavaScript work. In fact, I don't know if I can admit this publicly. I don't think I'd really written HTML or CSS in forever and a day. So I kind of agreed with this feedback. And I thought, yeah, test-driven is kind of my thing. Cool. But I think there's a whole other camp of web developers, especially in Ember, on the other side of the spectrum. Maybe 70 or 80% of their day is just doing HTML and CSS. And in that boat, I think this is truly a quality of life improvement. I'm going to try and sell you on that by showing how I styled a star rating component recently in both versions. This is the live reload that's going to, of course, reload the page every time I make a change to this star rating component. I basically added a backdrop, so there's a set of stars that are black. And then on top of that, I'm going to add a set of stars that are blue. And so now I have the blue stars. And finally, I just want only a certain number of blue stars based on the star rating. So I'm going to add a width to the handlebars template. And now you'll see only 3 of the stars show up. Cool. Let's contrast this with the experience in hot reloading, where I'm arguing this is a true quality of life improvement. I got my star rating component. I'm going to add the backdrop. I save this instantly on the right. I didn't touch the editor. I didn't scroll. I didn't expand. It's just there. I go back to the div. I add my blue. It just pops in. It's there. And finally, we add the width component. Save that, and pops in. So this is pretty cool. Where else does this kind of rock, I guess? I think modal development. If you have a modal, especially not driven by the URL in Ember for some reason, having to re-click or do a couple steps to get that modal up is painful. Wizards, if you're not persisting to local storage or some backend on step 3, you're just trying to get the HTML tweaked, this is a huge pain. Just generally, I've heard some insane stories from friends of mine that were like, actually, we have to go through this whole wizard once, and then only the second time does it render really weird. It's like, oh, that's fun, yep. Probably my code or something that they were working on. So when I'm doing layout specifically, I say choose a feedback loop designed with layout in mind, because we want to choose productivity. Our third story here is on user experience, and my favorite thing about user experience is that I know nothing about it. So how would I define it? Actually, my favorite definition, I can't give credit to it. It was at a Elixir conference earlier this year. They had a big user experience talk happening, and they asked the audience, hey, what's your definition of user experience? And some random person just threw out the most baller definition, and they were like, yeah, we should put that on a slide because ours is garbage. They basically said removing software from the experience. And the best news is this is our secret weapon. I think Sam said this as well. I swear I wasn't peeking over his shoulder. But this is our secret weapon, if it's not obvious. We don't spend time bike shedding. We actually get to work. It doesn't mean this is necessarily the easiest thing to do. So there's obviously some time involved. But I think as front-end engineers, we should be thinking about this as our play, our value add, our superpower in meetings and refinements where we're trying to come up with features for products. Because when we do this well, we're actually creating great feedback loops in the products for our customers, making them more efficient. And when we don't do it so well, well, you've all been here. Modal inception. Pretty frustrating. My favorite thing about user experience, though, is that it actually feels like for the first time in my life, I'm able to give the gift of time back to the customers. Now, I sort of ripped this slide from that earlier test-driven example and just kind of changed the labels. It doesn't really work. But I thought the part that did work was the very beginning, because there is something valid here that user experience is not free. Just like in our testing example, you have to make an investment. And the teams I've been on that do this really well, they actually spend the time and do the research, understanding the user and what they do in the domain. But just like in the testing example, eventually this pays us back. Hopefully we create experiences handcrafted for the user where the software kind of melts or fades into the background. I did this at work recently, so I'm going to show a quick example. But to kind of give people a quick overview, I work in the security space, and we have this component here on the left called the storyline. And the whole point between the storyline is an analyst might be working at a big company, and they're trying to triage an incident to determine, is this a real security problem? Like I need to take action, or is this kind of a false positive, I'll just move on to the next incident. And of course, you can see there's not a full set of data here. A lot of times they jump into our forensics tool to see what's going on. So we're going to show what the experience was like when I first came in to this company and said, hey, what's the back and forth between triage and forensics? They were like, all right, cool. So we got this network event, and we want to be able to look at the packet information, so we're going to do a little hover over. Everybody loves that UX. And then there's this option that's like pivot to investigate, which is the name of our forensics tool. So it's like, all right, oh, well, now it's a new window. That's kind of interesting. First red flag, opening a new window. Oh, actually, it's the wrong forensics tool. We don't have a link to go to this one called event analysis that I highlight here. So we need to pivot again, jumping to this tab. I'm just loving this experience. Then finally, when this thing loads up, I actually have to take a piece of identifying information and do a quick query because we're just at a blank page. And then I can do a query here to search for those events again. And then assuming I got the right event, gosh, this has been a long ways. I click on the network event, and I finally get this packet viewer to show up here. Oh my gosh, yeah. I was pretty frustrated. I had a lot of empathy for the analysts thinking, hey, this storyline, how long do they work in here, and how many of these events do they look at? Oh, it could be 100,000. Oh, they have all day? They have 10 minutes. Oh, cool, setting them up for success. So here's what I did instead. I thought, you know what? The user experience of clicking is just insane. Let's make it so they can click right there. So I just make it so we can click it, and instantly we show it. Props to the team who worked on this, actually. They made it just an Ember add-on. So I think in under an hour and a half, I did this whole thing working. But you can imagine as the end user, an hour and a half of my time was like life-changing. But the other thing's really cool here, and I think good user experience encompassed this idea as well. They didn't actually leave the context. Remember, they're trying to work an incident, triage it. Every time they were leaving this forensics tool and having to come back. Here, they're actually right in line, which is kind of cool. This changes the conversation, the words that our customers use to describe these products. They say, oh, instead of I have to, I'm locked in, I get to. Look how awesome this is. So when you're designing feedback loops, choose ones your customers will love. Choose productivity for them. All right, what do we do with all this new information? This friend of mine. Well, my hope is that the very simple work smarter, not harder is accessible to everyone. And if applied correctly, your productivity becomes exceptional. The challenge is work smarter, not harder is pretty fuzzy, pretty generic. The truth is, I can't define it for everybody. It's going to look a little different depending on your experience and what you do. But one thing I struggle with in talks like this especially is, seems like there's a silver bullet here, right? I've given a prescription for success. It's test-driven, hot reloading. No, I don't believe any of that. It's simply getting faster feedback. So if test-driven isn't your thing, doesn't fit your problem, you hate it, find something else. Ember Twiddle, a style guide, something that's just going to give you faster feedback than letting your whole app reload and clicking 1,000 times. Same with hot reloading. A quick note about that. I think the author of that add-on might not be exceptional. Heads up. So it doesn't actually work with engines was my brief caveat there, but you could check that out. But ultimately, CodePen, which is also another great way to collaborate. You can maybe share a CodePen, do some layout work there. And finally, user experience. It may seem like you have to add and create and improve experiences, but I think another great way to think about improving products is protecting our customers from complex configurations, features they don't need. And as I roll out today, I want to give a special thanks to a friend of mine, Joe Roten. He's actually here in the back there. He put this whole slide deck together. I outsourced it. I'm so lazy. So let's give Joe a round of applause. Thank you.